of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, September 21st, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Orisanmi Burton, author of Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. And later in the show, David Vine on his latest project, Words About War Matter, a language guide for discussing war and foreign policy. Meanwhile, at 92, Rupert Murdoch to step down as chairman of Fox and News Corp, handing it over to his son, Lachlan, who's, I think, the Roman figure for you Succession fans. He's considered even further right than his dad, by some. House Republicans say they have a breakthrough on just one of the dozen appropriations bills they need to avoid a shutdown. Doesn't sound like too much progress, honestly, but we shall see.
I got the bibliography done, okay?
Yeah, right. That's the energy it's giving off. Merrick Garland questioned by Republicans on the Judiciary Committee yesterday over his highly partisan decision to keep a Trump appointee on the Hunter Biden case. Oh, wait. The Fed leaves interest rates unchanged for now. Lena Khan's FTC adds senior Amazon executives to its lawsuit over deceptive Prime subscription practices. The UAW says Stellantis' latest offer is not good enough ahead of their Friday deadline. More strike actions likely. Meanwhile, the writers are reportedly getting closer to a deal with the AMPTP. And despite Tuberville's months-long efforts in the Senate, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff overwhelmingly confirmed. Trump's primary polling lead keeps growing. He hit 60% in Fox and Quinnipiac polls last week, a historic pace for a contested primary. Cassidy Hutchinson, the Meadows aide who testified for the January 6th committee, accuses Giuliani of groping her on that very day. I mean, he was just feeling it. You know, when you're doing a coup,
Freaks.
Emotions are high, you want to get a little action.
You got some hair dye running down the side of your face?
You know, who knows if that seeped into his brain? We'll never know. But Carrie Lake to announce her Senate run next month. The DOJ is looking into Senator Bob Menendez potentially taking literal bars of gold from a convicted New Jersey developer as a bribe. This is in keeping with his history. I cannot believe he's still the senator from New Jersey. And lastly, the trial begins for the officers who arrested Elijah McClain, leading to a lethal injection of ketamine and killing him. All this and more on today's Majority Report. The first IM we get is from Antonin Scalia's ghost saying, "Come here, big tits." That is Rudy Giuliani's catchphrase. It's his legacy. But yeah, it's amazing. Like even on the day when you're supposed to be like, this is the time when I overturn the election. History will remember me on this day, so I've got to cop a feel.
I'm still horned up.
Animals.
Despite, yeah,
Just animals.
Hello, everybody. It's an EmMajority Report Thursday. We pre-recorded this excellent interview, which you will hear shortly, with Orisanmi Burton, and then we'll be speaking to David Vine. We booked both of them. Little did I know they are both not just professors at American, but professors in the same department, which is like amazing. So I'll bring that up to David once we do speak to him. But American University heavy show today. But honestly, the interview with Orisanmi was really great. So looking forward to bringing that to you guys. But let's get right into it because Rupert Murdoch, at 92, deciding to finally step down and hand over News Corp and Fox over to his son Lachlan, who, as I mentioned in headlines, he's older, but he's considered more of the Roman type, right? Like a little bit more alt-righty, a little edgier. He's not the one that James, who now says he's a liberal, who dropped out of Harvard to start his own hip-hop label, which then his dad had to buy. This is the other guy, the more true believer, I would say. And as of now, he is at least the person to take over for his father. Rupert Murdoch's legacy is that of unimaginable destruction, of viral cynicism, of hatred that he imbued in the international community, both in his work in Australia, in the UK, and in the United States, shaping presidential administrations, shaping wars, through his incredible amounts of power, might, and money. Go ahead,
He's
Matt.
a baron like, JP Morgan or any of those sorts of Henry Ford, except his product is sort of bigotry and, political propaganda, but also just vulgarity in service of political propaganda. One of the most significant people of the last 40 years.
100%. It can't be overstated, his impact and the destruction, the destructive impact. This morning when the news was announced, Bill Hemmer, Dana Perino, considered, two of the people who are a bit more respectable at the Fox News desks, announcing that Rupert Murdoch is stepping away from his role at the company.
Boss Rupert Murdoch is transitioning from chair of our parent company, Fox Corporation. In a note to employees today, he says he's decided that in November he will move to the role of chairman emeritus at both Fox and at Fox Corp. He says going forward, his son Lachlan will be the sole chair of both companies. In his note, Rupert Murdoch says for his entire professional life, he's been, quote, engaged daily with news and ideas, and that will not change. And he says he will still be an active member of the Fox community, reaching out with thoughts and ideas and advice as he does every day. He goes on to say, quote, our companies are in robust health, as am I. Our opportunities far exceed our commercial challenges. We have every reason to be optimistic about the coming years. I certainly am, and plan to be here to participate in them. But the battle for the freedom of speech and ultimately the freedom of thought, he continues, has never been more intense. My father firmly believed in freedom, and Lachlan is absolutely committed to the cause, end quote. In a news release today, Lachlan congratulated his father on his 70-year career in media. He says this, we thank him for his vision and his pioneering spirit, his steadfast determination, and the enduring legacy he leaves at the companies he founded and countless people he has impacted, end quote. We'd like to add our gratitude as well.
I'm sure you would.
Rupert Murdoch created all of this and so much more across America and the globe. His life's work has left an indelible imprint on the global media landscape. His contributions are both innumerable and extraordinary. And we thank him for letting us be a part of it all. Thank you, Rupert, and congratulations.
Indeed. And without him, we would not be here.
True on that.
And we thank him for that. And the point about his being in robust health and robust with ideas, we can attest to that.
You are right about it.
Man.
Robust with ideas.
Right. Lots of ideas he had. He has made an indelible impact. There's nothing beyond the fellatio there. There's the words are correct in the fact that,
It's kind of neutral. He made an indelible impact.
That's.
I wish that was delible.
Yeah. It is true. He has been in the ear of presidents, most recently Donald Trump, Tony Blair, until his ex-wife bonked him, allegedly. That's a fun read that I did the other night. Honestly,
Wendy
coincidentally,
Dang?
Yeah, Wendy Dang, total girl
or
boss.
Dang Wendy.
Yeah, dang. And then he stopped. He cut off his relationship with Tony Blair at that point, allegedly after his wife was involved. She had love letters to Tony that were discovered in the divorce proceedings, but we'll put that aside for now. Like, what he did with Tony Blair was also sell the Iraq War to him. He sold the Iraq War to the U.S. public through a torrent of Islamophobia and lies about WMDs. He was as instrumental as anybody in making that lie spread far and wide, including to someone like Tony Blair, who involved the UK in the Iraq War in large part due to his close relationship with someone like Rupert Murdoch, and then, of course, obviously his relationship with George W. Bush. Rupert Murdoch was instrumental in selling Brexit to the public in the UK. Turfism, the mainstreaming of trans exclusionary radical feminism, you can draw a lot of that more recently to Murdoch's television shows and papers in the UK, including, the supposedly more respectable Times of London, which he also owns. They were laundering anti-trans bigotry more recently. Infamously, he also did own the News of the World, which is now, I think, defunct, after they were embroiled in that phone hacking scandal where they hacked phones of celebrities, the royal family, the family of a little girl that got murdered so that they could sell that to the public. And, let alone Fox's role in selling the election lies, his presiding over Tucker Carlson being the top-rated host in the country, selling white replacement theory to the public. Being Bill O'Reilly holding that seat previously with Tiller the baby killer, anti-abortion extremism that Fox News was a huge part of, leading to the killing of Dr. Tiller. He was fine, seemingly, with Roger Ailes' persistent sexual harassment and assault regime when he led that network.
I mean, this man paid millions and millions of dollars to guys who were sexual assaulters.
COVID lies, climate change denial, the Islamophobia that I mentioned, that he fomented for years and years and years in the Bush administration, leading to the Islamophobia that he framed political conversations around Obama with, that his networks did as well. Anti-black racism directed at everyone from someone like Obama to anti-racist activists. You can draw a line to, like, many of the conspiracy theories about Hillary Clinton and the public perception of her as being kind of the mayor of corruption town that was sold to the public by Fox News.
Well,
he was a monopolist of disinformation, and I'm just trying to list these things so people, when they look back on this, understand what it was an impact. It was an enormous impact for the worse for this world.
I think we run the risk of blaming all of the QAnon sort of stuff from on the internet and stuff like that. But Murdoch does as much as anyone to debase print media and you go into the profit of just complete scandal, especially with the Sun newspaper, but also with Fox News and the way that they handle stuff generally, all the way up, using tabloid stuff to further reactionary ends. I mean, it really debased the entire cultures and way of thinking about things like capitalism and stuff like that, the way he got involved in politics. One of the worst guys, we've seen.
Yeah, and Fox News is not going to change. I mean, he's created an organism that will be self-sustaining in a way. We will see where it goes from there. But his career is marked by also being somebody who wasn't just comfortable with disinformation being pushed by his own boutique outfits. He wanted to be a monopolist. He bought up at a certain point 70% of the papers in Australia, then bought a ton of papers in the UK, and then in the United States he bought the Wall Street Journal as well. He wants his impulse for endless growth, and also the bigotry that his networks espouse is as emblematic of the destructive nature of capitalism constantly needing to grow to the point where it becomes such a behemoth that it's impossible to take down.
Yeah, he split. I mean, the '80s supported the Brits in the Falklands. Like, he's always seen the use of war in terms of making profit for himself. Also big against the miners' strike in '84 and '85. Supported the police and Thatcher. So I mean, you know, it's Murdoch.
Yeah, it's Murdoch. I mean, people know, but I think it is important to, as he announces this, to reflect on that legacy, and I'm sure we will do some more in the weeks to come as we reckon with it, because he really was. He's like in Lord of the Rings. What's that guy's name? Wormtongue. He's a bit of a presidential Wormtongue. The guy that goes in the no one's.
Wormtongue's too powerful. Or no, isn't he like not powerful?
Wormtongue is the guy that gets in the ear of the king and makes him weaker by spreading.
See, I think like Murdoch, but I kind of like I knew that, but I feel like Murdoch is almost his own like kingmaker.
That's true. That's maybe selling him short a little bit. Before we get to our interview, we have a word from one of our sponsors, Babbel. What do you call a person that speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. Someone who speaks 2, bilingual. Someone who speaks 1, American. I know, that's really embarrassing for the Americans.
Roast us.
I learned this because I went to visit my family in Finland, and they learned 3 languages. Like, they learned Finnish, and then because of less than 10% of their population is Swedish speaking, they learn Swedish too, and they learn English. I mean, that's just, like, way higher percentage of Americans, like, speak Spanish as their first language, and we don't even mandate that in the United States. That's crazy. Only 22% of Americans speak a language other than English at home. Start learning a new language this fall and be the exception, not the rule. Because with Babbel, you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. Babbel's courses can help you learn real-life conversational skills. It's so easy to pick up on how to order food, ask for directions, speak to merchants, without having to consult language apps while on vacation, etc. Look, people are starting to go on vacation a little bit more now that certain COVID restrictions are easing. I feel like, there were a lot of European trips this summer. If you want to take a certain trip like that, it's good to be able to speak the language, order what you want to order where you're going. This fall, you can start speaking a new language with Babbel. Why Babbel? Because it works. Instead of paying hundreds of dollars for a private tutor or fooling yourself with language apps that are little more than games, Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are designed by over 150 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations. All of Babbel's tips and tools for learning a new language are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners to get you started right now. Get 55% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/majority. That is 55% off. That's more than half. 55% off your Babbel prescription. Babbel.com/majority. Babbel is spelled Babbel. Get 55% off at babbel.com/majority, spelled babbel.com/majority. Rules and restrictions apply. All right, guys. We are going to now head into the interview that I recorded earlier this morning with Orisanmi Burton. Enjoy. We are back, and we are joined now by Orisanmi Burton, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at American University, author of Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. Orisanmi, thanks so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So your book is excellent, and everybody can get it if they go to the description of wherever they're listening to or watching this, or go to majority.fm. And you argue that prisons, as currently constructed, aren't just ways to repress groups. I think that's well established in leftist discourse or as an instrument of social control, but that they are a part of a long history of warfare, hidden domestic warfare in the United States. Why did you think that that distinction and that framing was so imperative to what you wanted to get across?
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for engaging the book. I mean, there's lots of different ways to understand what the prison is and what the prison does. And historically, one of the things that has sort of not been emphasized is the extent to which prisons have been used as a strategy to contain specifically Black radical organizing and the Black radical organizing of the 1960s and the 1970s. And so that's really what I set out to do in the book. And what I found through this process is that there's a constellation of state actors, some of whom are embedded in the prison systems throughout the United States, some of whom are in the sort of national security state, who are using the prison as a strategy of counter-revolutionary warfare and employing counterinsurgency techniques developed in global laboratories of empire as a way to demobilize and contain social movements. And so the war analytic was really important to bring out because in some ways it's not really a secret. It's just something that doesn't get talked about. And so if you read the sort of literature of many of the state actors who administered these programs, they're very clear about the fact that they're engaging in a form of warfare. The language of war is saturated all throughout their documents and their public speeches. And so what I tried to do was to retell some of the stories that we think we know about the history of the prison movement and the prison system, but using that language of war to help clarify what it is that we're actually dealing with.
Well, it makes it more clear, right? The immensity of the struggle, and it also, I think, is clarifying when you even look backward from, before Attica, where a lot of the book is centered, but when you look towards slavery, and if you see that as warfare, not between state actors, but of a repressive government with colonial ambitions against a segment of the population, then it's easier to see, like, Reconstruction as a partial surrender, or the failures of Reconstruction as a partial surrender, and then the prison industrial complex being a method of continuation of the previous warfare on that population.
Yeah, this is really interesting because part of what my analysis does is it's not attempting to displace or dislodge another popular way of analyzing the prison, which is a form of slavery. But it is trying to think about the sort of genesis of this power relationship and this relationship of domination. And if you look at sort of the paradigmatic explanations for slavery, it's not in law. So it's not the 13th Amendment, right? It's not legislation. The paradigmatic justification for slavery is that captives captured in a just war can be legally enslaved. And then if you look at some of the sort of classical liberal theorists who write about slavery, they define slavery as a form of warfare. So John Locke, for instance, talks about slavery as a form of war. And then you can look at slave narratives like those from like Olaudah Equiano, for instance, who wrote a beautiful slave narrative. He talks about slavery as a state of war. So the analysis of prisons as slavery and the analysis of prisons as war are not they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And your point about Reconstruction is exactly right. And if one, for instance, goes back and rereads Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, he also talks about how after the abolition of slavery, that white supremacy continued through an organized form of guerrilla warfare. He's actually talking about slavery and warfare as well. So again, part of what I'm trying to do is to sort of weave these threads together and help to see if we can maybe sharpen our analysis.
It sharpens the analysis in a way that makes the relationship between state power and Black radicalism and Black people in this country more clear, because then you can see it as violence and a continuation of it as well when you put it within a warfare framework. And, I guess this is a good time to talk about Attica, because part of the book, or a huge part of the book, is centered around the term that you coined, the Long Attica Revolt. If you don't mind explaining to our audience what that means within this context.
Sure. So many of your viewers may have heard of the Attica Rebellion, which is generally understood as a 4-day prison rebellion that erupted in a prison in Western New York near Buffalo on September 9th, 1971, and then was viciously crushed under the authorization of then Governor Nelson Rockefeller on September 13th. So it's typically understood as a 4-day rebellion, and it's typically framed in a way that emphasizes the demands for improving prison conditions. So that's the dominant narrative of Attica. It's not entirely wrong. It's just incomplete in really powerful and important ways. And so when I'm talking about the Long Attica Revolt, I'm acknowledging the fact that the rebellion that happened in Attica was in fact the culmination of a protracted period of rebellion that lasted well over a year and traversed different carceral sites all throughout New York State. So a year before the Attica Rebellion, there was a series of rebellions in the New York City jails, which involved many members of the Black Panther Party, members of the Young Lords who had been targeted by COINTELPRO, and then other sort of incarcerated people who were incarcerated for assumptively non-political crimes, who were politicized behind the walls. A month after the jail rebellion was suppressed, by transferring many of the people in that rebellion to other prisons, another rebellion emerged in Auburn prison, which lasts for 8 months. And then Attica happened. And many of the people who were involved in Attica were involved in these other sites of struggle. And so it's only by looking at the rebellion through the lens of the state in such a way that tries to sort of separate and truncate and really incarcerate these struggles that Attica is this 4-day event. If we take this broader view and look at it through the eyes of the people who were actually leading the struggle and theorizing the struggle, then we see that it was this much longer protracted revolt. So that's what I mean by the Long Attica Revolt. And the other thing I'll say is that while many of the demands involving Attica were in fact about improving prison conditions, it's also true that many of the people who were at the front of that struggle had radical and revolutionary abolitionist and internationalist demands. And that aspect of the struggle has also been truncated. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to bring that to light.
Yeah, and the international angle I really do want to get into as well. But just the fact too that in Attica specifically, like there were just state-sponsored lies that were perpetuated by the Rockefeller administration about how that went down. I think that's a really useful lens for people to look at. You know, whenever you hear claims from whether it's a municipal or like county police or organization, or if we're talking about what the FBI claims about its response to Black radicalism, this story is so important because it imbues you with like a healthy skepticism. If you don't mind talking about the reaction from the Rockefeller administration at that time.
Right. So there were lots of ways that the Attica Rebellion could have ended. On September 13th, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, under with the support of then President Richard Nixon, authorized a siege of Attica Prison, where a state assault force composed of state police, New York State troopers, and prison guards laid siege to the prison with heavy artillery, killing 39 people in a matter of minutes, and then tortured hundreds of others for a protracted period of time. It was a very gruesome and horrific story. And then they tried to cover it up, saying that the incarcerated people were the ones who actually killed, because they killed 10 of their own hostages. The state assault force killed 10 white prison guards who were being held hostage. The state later lied and said that it was the incarcerated people who did that, that they castrated them and slit their throats, and telling a narrative that very much plays into sort of racialized understandings of sort of what this horrific image of incarcerated Black and other people of color are. But in fact, it later came out that it was the state that committed the vast majority of the atrocities. So there was a cover up there, and I agree with you that understanding, the way that state secrecy and state propaganda works is essential. But I think there's another element here, which is that, there's the cover up, but then there's the fact that we don't fully understand until now, I would argue, the revolutionary legacy of Attica. And that's not because the state didn't cover it up. That's not because the state covered it up. That's because there's been this dominant liberal narrative that has refused to analyze the prison as war, even though the people on the front of the struggle were saying of themselves, we're revolutionaries and we're engaged in a revolutionary struggle to transform society. And then people like Rockefeller, who were opposed, were saying the same thing. These people are revolutionaries and they're engaged in a revolutionary struggle to transform society through the prison. And yet somehow, 50 years later, the dominant narrative continues to be that Attica erupted as part of this sort of spontaneous combustion event that had nothing to do with a protracted period of organizing, and that the vast majority of what the people wanted were minuscule reforms to the prison system. And so even beyond this idea of the cover-up, there's this idea of these kind of bloodless liberal narratives that refuse to analyze the struggle on the terms laid out by the people who were sort of at the tip of the spear, as I call it in the book. And so that's what I try to do.
And that leads you down lanes of reform as opposed to abolition when we're talking about the scope of the struggle there. And what you do so effectively as well is connect it to like larger systems of repression. They're the tip of the spear, but at the same time, this is the second part of the book where you talk about prison pacification, which is the reactionary institutional crackdown to rebellion. You mentioned COINTELPRO earlier, but you also touch on the CIA's response, which internationalizes this. If you don't mind explaining that to the audience.
Sure. So there's a CIA response. There's a second FBI response. So people know about COINTELPRO, which resulted in assassinations of leaders, but also political frame-ups, which led to people being incarcerated. There's a little-known FBI follow-up to COINTELPRO called the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, which was essentially another layer of COINTELPRO for people who were already incarcerated. So similar forms of counterintelligence program, FBI repression, were being organized and orchestrated against people who were already inside. And then my research also looks at the extent to which CIA-affiliated professors, behavioral psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors were doing essentially MK Ultra experiments on Black revolutionaries. And so I think there's a general sense of MK Ultra. People have a sense of what that is, but I think there's been a lack of investigation into the ways in which MK Ultra has been used to repress the Black liberation struggle. And so that's part of what I'm looking at.
Not to cut you off, but you could continue that warfare kind of motif and say that that's a form of torture, essentially experimenting on Black radicals with drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, trying to understand why they think the way they do, right? So there's that aspect. And then is there a way to make them think otherwise?
Yeah.
If not, at least identifying them so that we can keep them separate from the population. And it's absolutely tied to warfare, because many of the psychologists and psychiatrists who were carrying this out, came from the Korean War. They were plugged into the sort of Cold War apparatus. They worked for counterinsurgency think tanks, and many of the sort of insights that they gained from these experiments were then later applied elsewhere in other sort of theaters of war. So it's definitely all tied up into this overarching schema of warfare.
And there were assassinations that were done in our kind of domestic war. If you don't mind talking a bit more about how that was another method of like this this reactionary institutional state violence.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the challenges of this book has been sort of collecting evidence and sort of figuring out how to make claims that are actively denied, how one deals with silences in the archive, right? And so when we think about the sort of most famous or most well-known, you know, assassinations of Black leaders, you know, very rarely do we have incontrovertible proof of these things, right? And so we have to make connections, we have to understand the context, we have to do a lot of analysis and theorizing. And so I try to be very careful in the way that I make my claims about things like that. But in terms of the prison movement, I mean, George Jackson, an imprisoned revolutionary in California, would probably be the most famous instance of a member of the radical prison movement who was assassinated by the state. There's a good book on that called Who Killed George Jackson. It's kind of hard to find, but it's very good. But I mean, there's an abundance of oral history information about specific individuals who were killed. There's no way to incontrovertibly prove that these were state-sanctioned assassinations that were part of a broader political program. But yeah, neutralization is the sort of keyword that the state uses, right? So we can see that term neutralization used in COINTELPRO documents, and that is a counterinsurgency term, which means convert, capture, or kill. And so J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, was very clear about his desire to neutralize Black revolutionaries on both sides of prison walls. And part of neutralization, one aspect of neutralization is to kill.
And I think people have that understanding about, you know, Hoover's targeting, right? But there's still not the conscious connection between like how institutional the FBI targeting of Black activists, radicals, was to the like subsequent push for methods of mass incarceration, which includes the drug war, which really kicks off in the 70s. Like, I still think there is a desire to look at Hoover's reign as a siloed piece of history, as opposed to a continuous kind of method and structural that it is within the structural DNA of the FBI, right? Like they're under the Trump administration, the FBI created that category of Black identity extremism. I believe actually Ken Klippenstein broke that story over at TYT. And that's not, you know, Hoover's like a zombie walking around still writing up these documents. This just is essentially a part of what like a federal police force as constructed in the United States feels its duty is.
Yeah, it's interesting because in that Black identity extremist document, they refer to what they believe to be the Black identity extremists of today and their connection to the Black Liberation Army, which was the sort of primary representation of what the FBI would call Black extremism in the 70s. So there's a sense of the continuity there institutional continuity there in terms of how the FBI is narrating its own programs. So once that memo was revealed, that caption, Black Identity Extremists, was formally discontinued. So formally it doesn't exist anymore. But then we can look at the repression of, activists organizing against Cop City, for example, and see similar logics there. So there's definitely a continuity there. One other thing, so the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, which was this prison-based successor to the counterintelligence program, was formally established in 1973 after J. Edgar Hoover gave one of his last public speeches before he died of a heart attack in 1972. So the Prison Activist Surveillance Program, I mean, his imprint is on there, but that program emerged after Hoover had already left the FBI. And the program officially only lasted for like 2 or 3 years. It was formally discontinued, but then it was absorbed into the normalized institutional practices of state prison systems all over. And so this is what I mean when I say it can be very hard to trace these relationships over time because of the way the bureaucracy works to sort of obscure what it's doing.
And how integrated it is, and I'm returning to the international element, with other like national security concerns or big umbrella terms like terrorism or like communism, really, back in the day. If you could draw talk a bit more about that history of how state repressive actors made this, connection between Red Scare politics as a way to crack down on black activism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so it's interesting. The Prison Activist Surveillance Program was, it grew out of an investigation carried out by the House Internal Security Committee, which was the successor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. They changed the name in, I want to say 1972, so that the organization could distance itself from the sort of stench of anti-communism, which started to fall out of favor with the rise of the new left. But essentially, the organization that was responsible for conducting the research that led to the creation of this counter-revolutionary anti-Black program was the institutional successor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. So you have that continuity between anti-communism, anti-Blackness, and what I would just call like a generic anti-radicalism that's institutionalized within the state. And then returning to COINTELPRO, one of the founding documents of COINTELPRO talks about, Hoover talks about the need to prevent the emergence of a real Mau Mau in America. Okay, now of course the Mau Mau was the name that the British gave to the Land and Freedom Army in Kenya, who were fighting against British colonialism in Kenya. And one of the key figures in developing that, in countering that revolutionary anti-colonial insurgency was someone named Frank Kitson, who wrote a book called Low Intensity Operations about his the knowledge he developed as a counterinsurgency expert in Kenya. That book then later becomes a key reference point for the FBI in the formation of COINTELPRO. So there's this global circulation of counterinsurgency knowledge. And this is what I mean when I talk about the paradigm of war. Right. And that when you brush away the sort of liberal criminal justice rhetoric that is in some ways just layered on top, underneath it, you see that there are these state actors who are empowered to traverse borders, who are thinking about politics as war in very explicit ways, and who are implementing strategies designed for war in the domestic sphere. And the prison is an outgrowth of that.
And like all warfare, it has a complete devastating effect on communities, and it continues today. How much did this affect, like, the groups like the Black Panthers trying to create communal organizations in different areas of the country, ripping apart those efforts at creating community structures as a way to rise up, both for empowerment reasons, but also just because they were, we were in the wake of slavery and Jim Crow and all of that, and there were efforts to create systems for Black people by Black people at that time, and state power was instrumental in crushing some of these things.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true, but there's also a contradiction there, and that contradiction is really the jumping off point for my book, which is to say that these repressive techniques were designed to demobilize various kinds of Black radical organizing, and one of the strategies of that repression was to incarcerate key organizers, key leaders, key intellectuals, but also sort of members of the lumpen class who weren't necessarily political, but who were, because of their economic conditions and because of their experiences with racism, were sort of primed for radicalization. So the strategy was to use the prison to demobilize those struggles. But my book really shows that in some ways this strategy backfired, because all of these people with these different philosophies, different levels of organizing experience were then corralled behind prison walls and subjected to intense forms of repression. And so they began to organize new formations within the walls, and those new formations gave rise to what I'm calling the Long Attica Revolt. And so this too becomes more clear through the paradigm of war, because it's about strategy and counter strategy and responding to different conditions as they arise. And so, yeah, the prison movement was in some ways a response to these attempts to demobilize movements outside the walls.
Lastly, before I let you go, bringing it to our current context, what would you want the major takeaways for our audience to be in reframing a lot of language around prisons and radicalism, and how we move forward in a way that isn't just, the liberal reforms that you describe, and like that actually internalizes. I mean, you reference this at the start of your book, like MLK said it, that the right is the language of the unheard, and there is still the eternal struggle of within this warfare, people not being able to be heard.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of takeaways. I mean, I think if I could sum it up in the simplest terms, the first half of the book is about the Long Attica Revolt. The second half is about prison pacification and repression. So from the first half of the book, I would want people to really contend with the abundance and complexity and sort of creative genius of ordinary people who came together, organized themselves, created new formations, and just did some remarkable things, right? And we don't know about these things because the prison's role, one of its functions, is to hide radical histories from us, to make them disappear. So part of what I'm trying to do is to decarcerate these radical histories so that we can learn from them. Because a lot of what's happening today is very similar to what has already been done. So that would be my highest aspiration for the first half of the book. For the second half of the book is to really give people a clear and in-depth understanding of how counterinsurgency unfolds in the domestic sphere. Because again, we see that unfolding right now too, and Cop City is an example of that. And there are lessons to be learned from how these movements were repressed in the past. And so if people can pick my book up and learn about that in ways that help them become more effective as organizers, as thinkers who are trying to transform society, then I would feel extremely gratified.
All right. Well, the book is called Tip of the Spear: Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. Orisanmi Burton, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the American University. Links to the book wherever you're listening to this or watching this. Thanks so much for your time, Orisanmi. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We are back, and we are joined now by David Vine, Professor of Anthropology at American University, author of the book The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. And his latest project is Words About War Matter, a language guide for discussing war and foreign policy, which was recently published. David, welcome back to the show.
Emma, thank you so much for having me. I should be clear that this is not just my work. It's actually the work of a very large group of academics, activists, think tank types, journalists, and many others.
Absolutely. And I should say, it was, I remarked on this earlier, we're an American University heavy show today, as well as an anthropology. He's in the anthropology department, right?
That's right. That's right. Ori is a fantastic colleague of mine, and lots of intriguing crossovers between our work about war and violence.
Certainly. And that was, the subject of our discussion earlier. It was a domestic war against Black radicalism. But here we are talking about words of war based on the guide that you and many others put together. Our military apparatus is so good at obscuring what happens in warfare through euphemisms. What inspired you and your colleagues and others who worked on this to put this together?
I think many of us were really profoundly troubled by the way in which most people in mainstream conversations talk about war and foreign policy. Of course, the United States now is coming up on the 22nd anniversary of the global war on terror that the Bush administration declared in 2001, just days after the attacks of 9/11. And even that language, the war on terror, and the language of terrorism and terrorist has had life and death consequences for millions upon millions, tens of millions. The United States has been fighting wars constantly since 2001. By the Costs of War Project's estimate, 4.5 million people likely have died in those wars. And that's could be an underestimate. Tens of millions injured, 38 million people displaced. Again, these are coming from the Costs of War Project at Brown University. And language like that of describing people as terrorists, language like the war on terror, has made these wars easier to wage, made it easier for the Bush administration to launch them, and made it easier for administrations since then to continue to wage these wars. And we just in the news this week, the Indian government appears to have assassinated a Sikh leader in Canada that they branded years ago as a terrorist. And so this language has actually gone around the globe and made it easier for repressive governments to kill and assassinate and murder people, anyone they don't like. Just branding them as a terrorist makes it easier to kill. But this is just one example. The guide points out that there are plenty of examples, ways in which people who discuss war and foreign policy use language, terms, words that obscure what's going on, that obscure the brutal, bloody realities of war. Language like bug splat, which is a term that drone operators use to describe the human beings that they kill with drones fired from drones firing missiles. Language like even the all-volunteer force, which has been the term to describe the U.S. military since the end of the draft. If it was really an all-volunteer force, why would the military wouldn't need to spend billions upon billions of dollars recruiting every year? The military, of course, is made up predominantly of folks who have few other options, and it's far from a volunteer force. It's a force that is sometimes recruited again with billions of dollars, and I could go into more detail, but I apologize for going on longer than I wanted.
Well,
Happy to provide more examples.
Selling, the promise of education, among other things, and getting kids often right out of school. But I wanted to touch on the point that you made about the international spread of this kind of language. I was about to just ask you that same question in relation to how Modi designated this particular Sikh separatist leader. But, you see it in other kind of militaristic, right-wing, but not always, regimes. Everyone in Palestine who chooses to express opposition to Israeli apartheid, it's a terrorist. It's a terrorist. Or we had to bomb this school because it was near a terrorist cell. This is the legacy of U.S. empire, and it is one that is ongoing.
It is, and it indeed extends from U.S. wars to the Israeli war against Palestinians to Modi and the repressive Hindu nationalist regime there. And it is worldwide. Our focus is on the United States, and the guide does focus on a U.S. context because, of course, the United States has been the most violent force in the last couple decades in terms of launching and pursuing wars. But we need only look at Putin's war in Ukraine. This isn't a war, he says. He consciously avoids that word.
Denazification or whatever
exactly.
He uses, yeah.
A special military operation, quite similar to U.S. military leaders' language about an overseas contingency operation, or as members of Congress and military leaders refer to it as an OCO. What is an OCO? What's an overseas contingency operation? This is war. And we need to talk plainly about war so that people can make decisions about war with the human consequences of war firmly in mind. And so often the language of special military operations, of overseas contingency operations, this disguises what's going on and makes it easier for governments to wage wars that have bloody, deadly consequences for millions upon millions of people.
Let's pull up the guide here, and we can just go through a little bit of what you, David, among many others, put together here. This is the beginning about the euphemisms surrounding killing and murder. This is just helpful for people. So, like, when you see casualties, understand killed and wounded. Collateral damage means civilian killings, civilian deaths. To drone somebody, this is also helpful given our context. That's an assassination. The fallen, it's more helpful to describe them as the dead, among other things here. You scroll down a bit as well, the contingency operation part. Overseas contingency operation means war. Precision bombing obviously means that's just a bombing. And neutralizing just means to kill. The overseas contingency operation thing to me, based on, how Putin has adopted similar language is important, I think, to flesh out too, because these kinds of operations in the war on terror era are so ubiquitous, or I mean, that's not even, it's quotidian is a better word for it. And they are also under the shroud of secrecy. We know very little about our overseas contingency operations. Actually, X that out, use the guide here and say the wars, acts of war that we do in places like in Africa that are just like not reported really in the Western press. If you don't mind talking about the role of those, of framing those things as operations as opposed to what they are, like military exercise, anything ranging from a military exercise to an active war.
Sure. And, an example is the U.S. military presence in Niger, where even members of the Senate Armed Services Committee had no clue that there were upwards of 1,000 military personnel when a few years ago, a few members of the military were killed. Our language, just to be clear, is very much about putting emphasis and attention on all the human and environmental costs of war, including on U.S. military personnel, which so often the language disguises the effects and damage of wars to U.S. military personnel, as well as to civilians, which are called, enemy non-combatants or collateral damage so often. But indeed, the language of the boots on the ground or military footprint, these kinds of terms also disguise what is a U.S. military presence that often takes the form of large numbers of military bases, as have been popping up throughout much of Africa in the past 2 decades of the post 9/11 wars, which I think is a better term than the war on terror, because again, that's just Bush administration PR and rhetoric, and so often disguises what these troops, military personnel, are doing when they are on the ground. They're not just boots. They are pursuing, in many cases, wars or supporting, in the case of bases and the kinds of war exercises that they are carrying out, supporting repressive regimes in a whole variety of ways. So this is part of what we're trying to change. We're trying to ditch the Orwellian, dehumanizing, euphemistic language and just encourage people to use clear, plain, honest language that speaks the truth, that tells people what the U.S. military is doing around the world, including waging wars in places like Somalia, where very few people know the United States has been at war for years upon years, or where in Yemen, the U.S. has continued to support the Saudi-led war for years without public scrutiny.
Right. And I even slip into it, right? Calling it the war on terror. You have to kind of deprogram to a degree. The element that I found really important was, and something you don't often think about and you can slip into, avoiding using the leader of a country's name to refer to that nation when in wartime. What are the propagandistic aims of using someone like that? Saddam Hussein was an example that was listed in the guide, if you don't mind explaining.
Yeah, no, this is ubiquitous in mainstream journalism, in foreign policy discussions, in international relations among academics. And it is difficult to avoid because it is so ubiquitous, it's so all around us that it's hard, even when we are trying to make ourselves conscious of the kind of language to avoid. It's very hard to avoid slipping back into it, but it is worth the effort. In the case of using a leader to stand in for a whole country is a perfect example. The conversations about the Bush administration waging a war in Iraq were focused on Saddam Hussein, which disguised, of course, the effects of any war in the lead up to the war, disguised the effects of war that they would have on millions upon millions of Iraqi people. The vast majority, of course, had no support for or love for Saddam Hussein. But by talking about it as a U.S. war on Saddam, it was a way to disguise what such a war would do, and then ultimately to disguise what the war did do, which was kill likely upwards of 1 million, at least, Iraqis, displaced around 10 million Iraqis, and has had consequences that reverberate to this day, including with the creation of ISIS, the Islamic State, which did not exist and would not have existed were it not for the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. And currently, of course, there's a lot of talk about Xi, the leader of China, and often he stands in for, 1.3 billion Chinese people. Similarly, people just refer to a country as a whole, China, as if an entire country is a homogenous thing. And this is part of what is fueling, and I think it's important to state clearly that racism, of course, is underlying a whole lot of this. The talk of Xi and China is part of anti-Asian racist fear-mongering that is growing in the United States and that we need to push back against. And of course, racism throughout the post 9/11 wars has made it easier to wage war against people branded terrorists. It made it easier to engage in Islamophobic rhetoric that has then made it easier to kill Muslims and Arabs. I would just point to one other really key example from our guide, our Words About War Matter guide, again, because it is so widespread, so often used, and that is the name of the agency responsible for the US military itself. This is an agency that formerly was called the Department of War, the War Department, and that was a much more honest way of describing that agency and what it did. Since the early days of the Cold War, it has been referred to as the Defense Department. But what has that agency been involved in since World War II? Largely, it's been involved in offensive wars that have killed tens of millions and destabilized huge swaths of the globe. The extent to which that department is engaged in anything we might call defense, I'm not saying it isn't involved in some degree of defense, but the extent to which it is really involved in defending the United States or anyone around the world is hugely debatable. So it's a word that I encourage people to avoid at all costs. That is the word defense, both in the name of the agency itself, but also in terms like defense spending. There are conversations about defense spending where we're talking about spending now upwards of $1 trillion a year if you include all the costs. This is not spending on defense. This is not money that is by and large defending the United States or US citizens or anyone. A lot of it is going to waging offensive wars. Similarly, language of defense contractors. Let's just speak honestly and plainly about what we're really talking about. In many cases, we're talking about weapons manufacturers. Again, it's not radical changes we're asking for, just clear, honest, plain language that describes what's going on in the world.
Lastly, it's kind of connected to what you were pointing out earlier, but just the usage of in painting broad strokes about large populations based on the actions of their government, whether it be imperial or like for propagandistic purposes for, like, say, the example that you gave for Saddam Hussein, when the United States is the one involved in the war, waging the war, I should say. I am troubled slightly by, not slightly, I am troubled by sometimes the xenophobia imbued with talking about Russian people as if they are a monolith that is complicit in the war in Ukraine and the invasion. And that is something that I think undermines global understanding, and it makes people feel like Russian people are this monolith, as opposed to say, would every American be referred to in that same manner in relation to, the United States' war in Iraq, which is equally as indefensible. So what about that dynamic and untraining our brains to see these countries as complex and as much of a kaleidoscope of different incentives and perspectives and humanities that we can reflect upon ourselves but choose not to with other countries?
I think this is such an important point, and I appreciate your calling it to our attention, because it is a kind of propaganda that we're fighting back against, and a kind of massive stereotyping of other people. And went on during the original Cold War, where the Soviets, the Russians, were demonized and prevented people, as people are being prevented from seeing now, the humanity of an incredibly diverse country like Russia, or again, China, in this era of a new Cold War, a new, really frightening, incredibly dangerous Cold War that could result in direct nuclear war that could take the lives of not just tens of millions, but billions of people. It's important to point out. I think it helps to remind ourselves to be specific, and as specific as possible, about who is doing what in the world, about the actors, to not talk about Russia does this, the United States does that. Even the United States invaded Iraq. The United States did not invade Iraq. The US military invaded Iraq at the direction of the George W. Bush administration. Let's be specific. And we could, throw in members of the media and corporate elites who supported that war, of course. But let's try to be as specific as possible and not talk about Russia or China or the Chinese or the Russians in broad strokes in this way that, again, dehumanizes, makes it harder to build international, transnational understanding, and to engage in real peace-building efforts to tamp down tensions between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China, which is precisely what we need to be doing to build international cooperation and understanding and move away from this incredibly dangerous moment of rising great power tensions of a new Cold War again that could lead us down a path toward nuclear war.
David Vine, professor of anthropology at American, author of the book The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. I interviewed David on that wonderful book, I believe for our Peacock show back in the day, but I would encourage everybody to pick that book up. And this project is called Words About War Matter, a language guide for discussing war and foreign policy. We'll put a link to everything in the description below, wherever you're listening to or watching this. David, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to talk.
Thanks so much. All right, folks, with that, we are going to wrap up the free part of this program and head into the not free part, the fun half. We'll be taking your calls, reading your IMs, making fun of people, and that's always fun.
Feeling superior, scoffing.
Yeah.
Conservatives.
Exactly. I do think that we are, at least our ideology is superior, and perhaps we're superior too. We are leftist supremacists.
Yes, absolutely.
The number is 646-257-3920. That's where we'll be taking your calls. But first, on ESVN, we did, a whole breakdown of Week 2 in the NFL. We dove deep into the Mike Babcock allegations and subsequent resignation. And then today, Bradley and I are giving our picks against the spread. I have started off horrendously, as Bradley did last year, which means good things for me. So, youtube.com/ESVN show for our picks.
Gambler's logic there.
Yeah. It's all the universe. It's a delicate balance, right?
It's been read for the last 3 times. It's got to be black this time.
Yeah. And Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning. We talked with Matt McManus on his new book about conservative or political right versus equality, going back to Aristotle even, and talking about Burke and Tolstoy, and really intellectual conversation. Really liked having with Matt McManus, who is a good lecturer, which means they make good podcast guests because you can kind of just let them cook. And we also talked about sometimes people need $5,000 just to be friends and continue doing it. Just a little pat on the back. Mm-hmm. So we talked about certain independent media figures taking money from Canadian philanthropists just for friendship and stuff like that, and how cool that is for independent media.
It's like Secret Santa, except
exactly.
What you get is $5,000,
and what you get is an investigation into Lula da Silva and corruption.
So check that out. I will be checking that out later.
Patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
Absolutely. Now we have the one and only Brandon Sutton, who is back.
The one and only, exactly. I am back. Back from London, back from Paris.
How was your mom?
My mom was great. She really enjoyed London. She enjoyed the Eiffel Tower.
Very nice.
What else can you want?
Did you enjoy?
Is that her first time in the cities?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Did you enjoy Paris? I thought you were kind of dreading it.
I'm not a big Paris fan. I'll be honest with you. It has nothing to do with, the people, but it does have something to do with, I just find it difficult to navigate sometimes. We'll leave it at that. But no, it was fine. The Eiffel Tower, it's beautiful.
I mean, isn't it like notoriously difficult to navigate because the city's kind of spherically shaped out from the center, or am I thinking of a different city?
I mean, Paris is old, so it has a lot of like the winding small streets and stuff like that. But I love Paris.
I've not.
Beautiful.
I want to
It's
go as
beautiful,
an
though.
adult.
Yeah.
I went when I was
beautiful.
6, so I don't really remember it. All I do is remember. I do remember the French Disney World where I got a sword, and that was the highlight of my trip. So
Isn't it great how Disney like has that effect of like you go to Paris as a kid and what
I
you
know.
remember is some cheap piece of crap plastic.
that was
I
my
considered
favorite
going.
part. And that like at age 6, I accidentally locked myself in the bathroom and didn't know how to open it, and they had to get the concierge to come and save me. But we don't need to get into that. Brandon, what's happening over on the discourse?
Well, we hadn't had a chance to record because I was in Paris and London, as I mentioned, but we will be getting back together this week to take care of that and ideally getting out some great content from the content mill, more grist, as the kids say.
All right. The kids do say that, I guess.
They do.
We are waiting for Matt Binder. He's a little bit late, but check out Scam Economy, check out Doom, check out the no, that's you. Check out Leftist Mafia. But do check out the discourse as well. Okay, the number is 646-257-3920. We'll see you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs that look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, it doesn't